Famous writers campaigned to free him. They called it rehabilitation. Within months, 9 women were dead. This is the story of how Austria's cultural elite helped release a convicted killer, and the institutional failures that let him kill again across 3 countries. I'm Serial Killer Profile, and what you're about to hear isn't just about one man's violence. It's about who society chooses to believe, who it chooses to protect, and what happens when those choices go catastrophically wrong. Stay with me. She had a name. She had a mother who waited for her to come home. She had friends, a laugh, habits that were ordinary and small, a favorite coffee, a song she hummed on bad mornings, the way she folded a letter before putting it in a pocket. Between late 1990 and early 1992, a string of women were found dead across borders in Vienna, Prague, and other cities far from each other. And what followed would expose something larger than the violence itself: the willingness of systems and institutions to look away from lives lived at the margins. This is not a story that begins with the killer. It begins with the people who were taken from the world. It begins with the quiet lives those women led, and with the family members left to ask how and why the protections meant to keep them safe had failed. We begin there because if storytelling can do anything useful, it should restore the dignity that the headlines so often strip away. To understand how this happened, you have to see what the public saw and what investigators were starting to see. When Johann Unterweger walked out of prison in 1990, it looked, for some, like a triumph of rehabilitation. He had been convicted in the 1970s and had spent years writing from inside a cell. Poetry, short stories, and autobiography. Intellectuals and writers read his work, and some publicly argued that it proved change was possible. In the cafes and in the papers, a redemption narrative was born. But this story asks a different question. What happens when a system chooses, with good intentions or blind optimism, to prize redemption stories over the hard, sober assessment of risk? After 15 years, the prison doors opened. The tension here is human and institutional at once. On the one hand, there were people who saw writing, contrition, improved behavior, things that matter in the calculus of rehabilitation. On the other hand, there were warning signs, skeptics, and procedural gaps. On paper, he looked like 2 different people. In Vienna's cafes, the writer, the reformed man, holding court with intellectuals. In police files across 3 countries, a pattern of movement, a forensic signature, and a growing list of victims. How did one man exist in both worlds simultaneously? Stay with me here, because what happens next shows exactly how systems prioritize narrative over evidence. The narrative that elevated his writing into proof of transformation sat beside parole procedures and monitoring systems that were, in retrospect, porous. That juxtaposition, hope without sufficient safeguards, is central to how we understand what came next. Over the months that followed his release, patterns emerged in the deaths. Investigators in different countries began to notice chilling similarities. Victims who had worked in sex work or who were socially vulnerable. Cause of death patterns described clinically as manual strangulation and ligature use. Bodies left in secluded or less traveled spots. This was a kind of forensic patterning that relies on detail rather than drama. Similarities in ligature technique, fragments of trace evidence, timelines that placed a particular man near multiple discovery sites. The puzzle of connecting those dots stretched across borders and across police systems, still adjusting to a changing Europe. Investigators later linked his travel patterns and journalistic work to places where victims were found. And by February 27, 1992, he was arrested in the United States. To tell this story without exploiting it, we must keep two truths in tandem. First, the investigative work mattered. It was painstaking, often technical, sometimes agonizingly slow. Detectives compared knots, examined fibers, checked timelines and alibis. They built circumstantial cases that eventually became the backbone of prosecution. Second, the women who died were not evidence. They were people with histories. That means we name them when it is verified and respectful to do so. When we cannot, we tell the contours of their lives the way family members and advocates have described them. Daughters, mothers, friends, workers doing what was necessary in a world that afforded them few choices. There is a moment in good journalism and in good justice where the institutional story and the human story must meet. If you're wondering how investigators connected all of this, that's what's coming next. The forensics work is where this case gets really interesting. For Unterweger, they met in court in June 1994. Prosecutors presented a case built on patterns, on forensic links, and on expert testimony. Psychiatric experts spoke to personality structures. One forensic psychiatrist's report, widely cited, characterized traits consistent with malignant narcissism and other clustered personality features. That testimony was used by prosecutors not to reduce the human to a clinical label, but to illuminate behavior they argued was dangerous. And when it was all laid before the jury in Graz, they found sufficient evidence to convict on 9 counts of murder. Yet, legally, the verdict remains subject to appeal. If this kind of systems-focused true crime analysis is your thing, subscribe now. I put one of these out every month, and they're all built on the same principle: understanding over sensationalism. Hit that notification bell if you actually want to see the next one. Okay, back to Graz, 1994. When we tell the story of a case like this, it is tempting to craft a single villain and a single moral, that the truth is far more complicated. There is a perpetrator, a man accountable in court, and there are layers of institutional choices that allowed this pattern to continue. There are writers and cultural figures who championed a narrative of rehabilitation, and in doing so influenced public perception. There are parole boards that weighed testimony and behavior against a set of rules and may have given too much weight to cultural prestige. There are police forces in different countries, limited by jurisdiction, resources, and evolving systems, slow to connect seemingly disparate deaths. This does not absolve or dilute responsibility. Rather, it expands it. Accountability lives on multiple planes. The investigatory sequence was not a thriller in the sense of dramatic revelations at every turn. It was methodical, often frustrating. A detective in Vienna might hold a sample of fibers from a car seat. Months later, a detective in Prague would match a similar fiber to a recovered item. Witnesses reported seeing a man at a certain place on a certain date. Travel records showed a journalist's presence on those dates. None of this is cinematic revelation. It is cumulative, incremental. When piled together, the weight of circumstantial evidence became enough for prosecutors to bring the case to trial. There was also a social performance to his public life. After prison, he published, he wrote. He used journalism as a kind of mobility, assignments, articles, a reason to travel. Prosecutors later argued that those activities provided legitimate cover and access to places where vulnerable women worked, places where surveillance or witness interviews were difficult because of stigma and the transient lives of many of the victims. Those are prosecutorial theories, not sensational claims. In our narration, we should make that clear. Investigators alleged, prosecutors argued, the court evaluated. As the case moved toward trial, public conversation deepened. Vienna's cultural circles began asking hard questions about their own role. Did intellectuals and artists, in their eagerness to believe in reformation, give credibility that the system should not have allowed to outweigh caution? Some defended their actions as humane. Others, watching the tragic intersection of advocacy and violence, later described a collective failure of judgment. It is crucial to present both sides with the nuance they deserve. The moral impulse to believe in change is not in itself a crime, but it becomes part of the story when institutional decisions, parole, and monitoring lean heavily on cultural prestige as a proxy for public safety. We're about to get to the trial and verdict, but first, this question of motive matters more than you might think. In the courtroom, discussions turn to motive, but motive in this case must be treated with care. Prosecutors argued that sexualized anger and hostility towards sex workers played a role. Psychiatric testimony spoke about personality traits and patterns that could help explain repeated violent behavior. These are interpretations grounded in expert analysis and the circumstantial case. They are not definitive metaphysical explanations for why any human being kills. We present motive as a prosecutorial and forensic construct, not as an absolute reason that settles all questions. Then came the verdict and its fraught aftermath. The Graz court convicted him of 9 murders by a jury majority that, under Austrian law, was sufficient for conviction. He was sentenced to life in prison. That sentence, the prosecution's evidence, the jurors' votes, they are all facts. Yet a final legal wrinkle remained. On the very same day as his sentencing, June 29, 1994, he took his own life in custody. His death complicated legal closure for families because appeals and final confirmation processes could not be completed in the usual way. For survivors and families, that ambiguity carries its own weight. Legal finality matters, even when it cannot, in itself, restore loss. What happened after the trial matters because it shows the limits of singular remedies. Some called for institutional reform. Questions were raised in parliaments and in the press about parole procedures, about monitoring, and about how cultural prestige had intersected with official decisions. Did the state change its procedures in meaningful ways? In some places, there were incremental adjustments. In others, critics say, the changes were modest and incomplete. The policy response was not the same as the loss of a life, but it was a test of whether systems could learn. Equally important is what did and did not change for the people who were most at risk. For many sex workers, for those who live in precarious circumstances, change is a slow grind. Advocacy groups point to persistent gaps in housing and access to health services, in the legal protections that could reduce vulnerability. That is the context that should remain front and center throughout this narrative. The deaths were not only a failure of one man's violent decisions. They were a failure of social systems that allowed certain people to be especially exposed. This program stresses an ethical boundary that too often collapses in true crime. We do not turn violence into entertainment. Their names matter. Their stories matter. And when we choose how to tell them, we choose whether to honor them or to let their lives be erased by the next sensational headline.
If you value this approach, if you think true crime can be both compelling and responsible, this channel is for you. Subscribe, share this with someone who'd appreciate it, and leave a comment with your take on the discussion questions I've posted below. Next week, we're examining Ed Gein, the man who inspired Hollywood's worst monsters. You won't want to miss it.